On today's World Insight, on the sidelines of the Boao Forum, we speak to Zhou Xiaochuan, a longtime governor of China's central bank, to find out how China aims to adopt digital currency and reach carbon neutrality. How to promote carbon peak and carbon neutrality is a dynamic planning issue.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Boao today. China's economy has gathered steam with GDP reaching about 4.8% growth and fiscal revenue up about 8.6% in the first quarter, despite the pandemic and geopolitical uncertainties. But amid various challenges world faces today, how will China and other economies prioritize their tasks? How will they match their actions with appropriate timetables for decarbonization against climate change? And here is my exclusive interview with Zhou Xiaochuan, Vice Chairman of the Boao Forum for Asia. Mr. Zhou is best known in the world for his 15 years as the governor of China's central bank, and now he's still regarded as a sage economic thinker with deep understanding of the Chinese economy and the international markets. And here's my conversation with him. With shifting priorities economies have, for example, geopolitics, pandemic, as well as the regional conflicts, how much attention do you think, Mr. Zhou, people are still having for sustainable development, particularly about the carbon?
可持续发展呢，是一个比较长时间跨距的这个概念，是吧？
Sustainable development is a concept that demands a longer period of time. It is not meant for short-term shocks, because current temporary shocks may pass shortly. Regarding sustainable development, I think what we need to pay attention to is environmental sustainability, especially the issue of climate change that you mentioned, which is a big concern for everyone. The other one is to make everyone receive benefits from economic growth, to halt the widening income inequality gap, which may result in some people being left behind and having limited opportunities. That will impact sustainable development.
再一个呢，我就是说呢，宏观经济政策、金融稳定不能犯大的错误，因为这个东西。
Last but not least, we cannot make big mistakes on macroeconomic policies and financial stabilities. For example, before 2008, the United States was engaged in subprime mortgage, and then in 2008, the subprime mortgage crisis occurred. The subprime crisis caused Lehman Brothers to go bankrupt, which caused the housing crisis, which contributed to the European sovereign debt crisis. It took us about a decade to get out of the shadows of the subprime mortgage crisis.
I noticed that you've been talking about establishing the appropriate mechanism and allocate the fund that has been collected from carbon trading, for example, and carbon tax to the right place. Mr. Zhou, how would that work? Because China seems to be at the very initial stage, even though it has been worked on for several years already.
首先呢，从概念上来讲，是吧？你看这个中国这个整个经济体制改革过程中强调的很重要的一个内容。
First of all, conceptually speaking, an important element emphasized in the process of China's economic system reform is the optimal allocation of resources. In other words, a requirement for economic development is the optimal allocation of economic resources.
和这个减排的这个资金安排啊，这个是异曲同工。意思呢，就是我们。
In this regard, the financial arrangements for climate change and emission reduction are similar. To do this well, we need to ensure that the resources are allocated optimally in the context of sustainable growth, especially that the funds for emission reductions are allocated optimally from collection, management to expenditure. To do this, We need to be efficient, which means we need to achieve our goal of carbon peak and carbon neutrality in 2030 and 2060, while reducing the negative impact on GDP growth. So resource allocation is very important. From historical experience, we need to use market mechanisms to achieve optimal allocation of resources. We need to gradually establish the market mechanism. This process requires full consideration of how to effectively allocate resources and how to achieve optimization. We could, for example, establish a reference system to compare the gap between the deployment and the optimal target so as to always adjust the program.
From your perspective, since you've been participating in supporting China and helping China to establish the market mechanism that you have been talking about throughout your career, you're a participant of it, that. So what do you think we can learn from earlier years so that could help us to establish the current market mechanism for the green development?
这个像碳减排啊，比这个绿色这个还稍微窄一点哈，就是
Green development is a big topic. Let's take carbon emission reduction as an example. The main source of carbon emissions is coal-fired power plants. Iron and steel, cement, and aluminium are also among the most carbon-intensive industries. Many enterprises are also involved to varying degrees of carbon emissions. From the perspective of individuals, there are also possibilities to reduce carbon emissions. For example, each of us can choose how to cook to help reduce carbon emissions.
所以涉及到这么广泛的这个内容的话呢，就是靠这个行政命令呢不容易做到。
From enterprises to individuals, it is not easy to rely on administrative orders to achieve the goal of carbon neutrality. Therefore, in such a wide range of fields with so many participants, the price mechanisms is the most effective way.
One of the things people have been asking is the appropriate pace and reason in developing carbon-related mechanisms and bring industries and different walks of life onto that platform. Now, Mr. Zhou, what is your thinking about that?
这是一个这个动态规划的问题，也就是说，它是要。
I personally think that from now to 2030 and 2060, how to promote carbon peak and carbon neutrality is a dynamic planning issue. Some people call it a roadmap, and some people call it a timetable, which is actually a plan to control total carbon emissions every year in the future. With this roadmap, the next thing to consider is whether to use administration management or to rely more on price guidance. It is actually possible to make an optimal curve from the present to the future, and how this curve can be drawn also depends on the future technology. How much efficiency can be improved and how much cost can be reduced by future technology is full of uncertainty, so we have to adjust the plan continuously in the process.
更难说了，所以这存在不太确定性，它还要在这个过程中动态调整。
There are other uncertainties too. For example, the economic realities of our economy and others' economies as well, isn't it?
应该说呢，总体来讲呢是，中国应该和其他国家呢都是共同努力。
Generally speaking, China should work together with other countries, but of course, the transition designed by each country is different, mainly based on their current economic and carbon emissions levels, but also on their level of development and financial capability. Because if you want to reduce carbon emissions in the future, you have to replace the equipment, you have to invest in research and development. So it has something to do with the country's financial capability, along with the joint international efforts. But I think this problem is not too difficult.
但是呢，我认为呢，这个问题呢也不算是太难，因为为什么呢？就是这个习主席已经明确提出了。
President Xi has clearly put forward the goal of carbon 2060, which means when the final roadmap comes out, it should be within the general framework. If the first phase is a little faster, the latter phase may be easier. Conversely, if the first phase is slower, the latter phase may be more challenging. But the end result will not be too big. The changes to the total amount is a matter of concern for everyone. At the same time, we must also ensure that we transition at the optimal rate.
同时来讲呢，这个我们也要注意呢，就是我们做这个东西呢，在概念上要使它达到一个优化的选择。
But businesses have already, putting in a lot of investment and thinking as well as a mechanism in order to make it work. So it's very important for them, the pace and the rhythm.
这个我觉得，微观的努力呢，要是从道理上来讲呢，他们应该在总量引导下来做。
I think the micro effort should be done under the guidance of the total amount, because if not under the threshold of the total amount, then a certain industry or a certain enterprise may surpass or lag behind. So the so-called optimal incentive mechanism guided by the total amount is still very important.
最优激励机制还是很重要的。当然，目前来讲呢，因为我们这个减排啊。这个其实呢，这个还是在早期阶段。
At present, our carbon reduction is still in the early stage, so the industries with more carbon emissions should put in extra efforts. However, individual practices such as those that are too far ahead or too far behind need to be evaluated with an overall plan, overall metrics, and overall optimization goals.
需要一个总体的这个规划、总体的这个度量和总体的这个优化的目标下指导下来评价。
Former U.S. Ambassador to China, Max Baucus, recently, when being interviewed, he was talking about now we are facing the danger of going into some kinds of Cold War in which it is going to be defined by culture and also by technology. Now, you already touched on about the technology related to the carbon and the new sustainable development. Are you worried that that could be one factor? Geopolitics comes into the way that would bring us to a more difficult situation about how to work together on carbon on 30-60 goals together with the rest of the international community.
担忧是肯定有的啊，担忧的主要方面不在这个碳减排上。
I think the concern is definitely there, but the main area of concern is not in carbon reduction. I also spoke about this issue at some recent events, and I saw some speakers at the Boao Forum discuss this issue. Personally, I think one of the biggest concerns is the trade system, because there is a Cold War mentality right now.
因为呢，你这个有这种冷战思维是吧？你看这个习主席专门说我们是反对冷战思维的，但是呢，这个世界上现在冷战思维的人数还不少。
President Xi specifically said that we are opposed to the Cold War mentality, but there are still quite a few people in the world who have the Cold War mentality. So this may have an impact on policy and practice. And in the case of the Cold War mentality, the efficiency brought by globalization will be lost.
那么最近呢，大家可能一种担忧呢，就是不要把金融也拖到一种冷战的格局。
Recently, there may be another concern, that is, not to drag finance into a Cold War pattern. The Cold War pattern of finance will have an impact on global resource allocation, payment system, financial stability, and thus will have a great impact on the global economy, and therefore on the future financial capability.
也会有很大影响。那么你这个未来大家都是说到什么几百万亿的这个投资，在这个在这个气候变化和这个减排上就需要那么大的资金。
In the future, we need a lot of investment on climate change and carbon emissions reduction. If your trade and financial systems do not work, it will certainly drag down the future. But on the whole, if there is such a Cold War mentality, I guess the impact will be on the exchange of carbon emission reduction technology, and the trade of carbon emission reduction equipment and technology is still relatively small. Perhaps these industries are most vulnerable to Cold War-style embargoes and sanctions.
可能更多的是在那些和这个冷战格局直接相关的那些领域啊，会有更多的这个封锁啊、制裁啊、 这个不良的这些现象。
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Let's move on to the finance part. You have been a strong advocate for digital currency. You have been putting years of effort into both research and the operation of that. Recently, we tested that, right, during the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing. Are you satisfied with the result? Of course, it's a small-scale test.
从理想的角度来讲呢，这个数字货币还应该比现在这状态发展的更好一些。
I think from an ideal point of view, digital currency should surpass its current state, which is also my hope. But inevitably, there are a lot of misunderstandings in the whole development process. Like at the very beginning, we don't know how to integrate it, and we don't know what is a good technical solution. And we don't know how to cooperate with the existing financial system, financial products, and financial infrastructure. So this process must progress from just talk to understanding, and finally to be put into practice. So do not be too hasty.
所以也是不可太着急。这个我也记得呢，在最早期的时候呢，那时候还是这个最早期引入这个数字货币的概念的时候呢。
I remember that in the very early days, when the concept of digital currency was first introduced, every meeting we had was basically a science fiction conference. And more than half of the people said they didn't understand it. This is also an inevitable process, because it involves a cross-industry integration.
因为呢，它涉及到一种跨行业的综合。有一些搞技术的人呢，他一说技术名词很懂，但他不知道这个业务那边怎么样。
There are some people in technology who know the technical terms very well, but they do not understand the business, nor the financial infrastructure, nor the financial risk and regulation. But people who are familiar with the finance can't understand so many technical terms at first. I think in general, it is still at an early stage, and I believe there will be more development in the future.
是一个初始阶段，这个相信呢，未来还有更大的发展。那初始阶段总体来讲呢，就是从这个系统的效能角度，我觉得还是不错的。
In the initial stage, in general, I think it is still good from the perspective of the effectiveness of the system, but it still covers a relatively small area, like the various payments, security and transactions, and customer adoption. But in general, it is still good.
总体来讲还是不错的。
Also about the pace of it, the development. How do you see it compared to the other countries? For example, the United States working on the digital currency, the private sector working on a digital currency.
这个呢，就是各个地方不一样。这个呢，也取决于这个我们说呢，就是发展的这个台阶的大小。
This is different from place to place, and it also depends on the size and stage of development, the driving force of innovation, and the use of new tools. In the past, the payment tools of some developed countries were very vibrant in general, and people were used to it. They thought it was useful, and supported upgrading it immediately. Of course, the developed countries are also different from each other. Many people feel very satisfied with using personal checks. After that, credit cards developed very well. There are also some countries like Germany that use more cash. Of course, debit cards are still in use, so the gap between cards are not big. Its development momentum is not sufficient enough. Credit cards in China have developed rapidly in the past 30 years, but the population is huge. and the penetration rate is still not high enough. So once smartphones added payment tools as a function, they became particularly popular. So the development momentum is also great. So we should say that we are doing well in this respect, and it is relatively fast. But you have to see that this is a process such that when you have weaknesses, more efforts need to be put in. Generally speaking, we have taken a relatively direct path with few detours.
就特别受欢迎，就是这个，所以呢，动力也大，所以我们在这方面，这个呢，走的是，应该说是还是不错的。
Do you see as some worried it's going to challenge the dollar-dominated current international currency system?
我过去一直讲呢，就是这个。
I have always said that the US dollar is still dominant in the global reserve and the global payment system. If there is any change, it is a very slow process for the role of the dollar to change, and to a large extent, it depends on whether the policies about the dollar will make mistakes. For example, if we rely too much on the dollar system to impose financial sanctions, of course, if you impose sanctions, people will hide from you, and your role in payment and reserves will inevitably decline. So this is understandable. But even so, it is still a relatively slow process, because from the perspective of reserves, from the perspective of value storage, it has great inertia. You can't say that the things you saved before are suddenly useless. From the perspective of payment, it is an issue of habits. This habit is that people still believe the value of the dollar, unless you have people saying otherwise and offering an alternative. So this is also a relatively slow process. It should be said that we advocate stronger diversification of the global dominant currency, including reserves, payments, and pricing.
You
recently strongly recommended that the digital currency that we are testing and now using in small trials are for the purpose of the convenience of the general public. Could you explain the deep reasons behind it?
主要的这个就是一个，就是相对而言，就是说有些人呢在搞数字货币的时候
，When some people are engaged in digital currencies, they think about whether it's used for cross-border remittances. Some people used it for trade settlement. Some people use it as a wholesale currency of the central bank and interbank clearing. So we think that retail is still the main option, considering we urgently need to improve the payment experience, so we provide the majority of residents with benefits. If we look at the trade settlement and payment system, we should not just look at it from a technical point of view, because from a technical point of view, you always think that I can easily replace it with a method. But in fact, there are many reasons behind the financial business. There are reasons for financial stability. There are reasons for trust. Combining them, it's not a big gap. Anyway, all businesses have room for improvement and upgrading with the developments of technology. But the room for improvement may not be big enough, and it only involves a small area. In addition, cross-border payment or cross-border use of currency involves the monetary sovereignty of some other countries, especially those that are relatively weak. Most people don't want their currencies weak. So that is to say, its obstacles are not only in technology, but also in other aspects. So when you don't consider it comprehensively, you will think it is replicable just because it is easy to achieve technically. Later, you find that the problem is much more complicated than this. So that is to say, in different application scenarios, taking care of the needs of the public after comparison is a better way to expand the market of digital currency for retail. Other aspects can also be developed in the future. On the other hand, no matter how the money is earned in the wholesale system, how it is earned in trade, and how it is earned by cross-border payments, finally, we have to see if the money is safe in our hands. No matter what form of data currency it is, can I use it or not? Can I go to the store to buy things? Can I pay the water and electricity bills? So in the end, retail is still the foundation. From this point of view, we must also do a good job in this aspect.
我们体现呢， 这个照顾大众的需求呢，从零售开始这个拓展呢，是个比较好的路子。
Last question about Boao Forum. This is, as far as I know, the only international forum that is being held in person, which is such a scale. I know you have been working for Boao for several years already. Behind the scenes, you have also been trying to bring in many of those with wisdom and knowledge to the forum to discuss important issues. Now, Mr. Zhou, tell me how much effort has been put into here in order to make it happen, because it has become quite a gathering, shall I say, even though a lot of things are taking online, but still people are extremely impressed about the fact that it is being held on time, in person.
这个呢，应该说我参加这个博鳌论坛呢，就是我在进这个博鳌理事会之前就已经参加过好多年，
I have participated in the Boao Forum for many years before I joined the Boao Council. Indeed, during the Boao Forum, the face-to-face discussion and contact, there are many other activities that attendees can discuss in person, in private, or on the screen. All of this, of course, these forms of discussion are more efficient. Due to the pandemic, the forum is in the format of both online and offline, so it affects the diversity of participants to a certain extent. Many foreigners can only participate online. In addition, private discussions that are remote may not be as comprehensive. The reduction in private discussions will have a certain impact on the forum. However, through these efforts, I think in general, the Boao Forum has achieved outstanding results. Under the circumstances of the pandemic, very few of these forums can be successfully held. In this case, many people actually have something to say, whether it is a lot of comments, views, or some arguments, so when we have this Boao Forum, it is more successful than we expected it to be. We originally thought that if there were some restrictions due to the epidemic, many people could only participate online, so they would not come anymore. But in fact, they are still quite enthusiastic. This also shows that the world is willing to discuss and listen to different voices from all sides in terms of development, cooperation, collaboration among Asian countries, as well as various issues such as the epidemic and geopolitics. At the same time, we can hear the important views. We can also hear the important voices of some national leaders, which is obviously beyond our expectations. But we still hope that we'll be able to meet face-to-face next year.
但是我们还是希望呢，是不是明年就能够大家面对面开会了？
That's my exclusive interview with Zhou Xiaochuan, former governor of China's central bank, now vice chairman of the Boao Forum for Asia. And that will be all for today's program. You can find us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. From Boao and my team in Beijing, thank you for being with us. Bye for now, and I'll see you back in Beijing later.